Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me. Today, I'm going to talk about how to come up with a plan for your vegetable garden. A lot of the class is geared for beginning gardeners, but I think it's also a great refresher for experienced gardeners, and you might pick up some new information and ideas along the way. All right, so this quote is very important to me. If you take away nothing else from this class, then I hope you remember this. Gardening is about always learning what works and what doesn't, trying new things, failing, and trying again. People always want to know exactly what to do, but there are so many different factors at play that it's impossible to have only one way to do something in your garden. It's always a process and it's always going. All right, so I've broken this class down into 3 different parts: the right place, the right plants, and putting them both together. Your garden needs context. You need to have a basic understanding of the natural forces at work in your garden, even if you have just a few pots on your porch. So here's some considerations for you when you're planning out your garden. What's your zone, sunlight and shade, your water source, how accessible is your garden, your soil quality, and preparing for unwanted visitors. There are entire books written about each of these topics, but today we're just going to go lightly over each of them. This right here is a quick sketch of my yard and my gardens. It's not to scale, but it gives you a general idea of what I'm working with personally. So I've got 4x4 beds in the back there. So is everybody able to hear me? Looks like some people are having a hard time. Okay, cool. Excellent. Thank you so much for the feedback. So on my map, I have the shade mapped out. My house and the big spruce tree provides a lot of shade for my garden. And then I have some fencing with my neighbors. And then at the very back, I don't have it in there, but there is a strategically placed apartment building that blocks a lot of sun for me as well. And so all of these considerations, I have to take into consideration too when I'm planning out my garden. All right, so everybody always talks about zones. USDA plant hardiness zones are a guideline to which plants will thrive in your location. It's based on minimum temperatures. So I went through and I looked up pretty much every zip code I could find for the Anchorage area, and I tried to include the valley as well. And I typed it into just an online generator, and it'll tell you what zone you're in. And so for the most part, we're in 4B. A couple of you lucky ones are in 5A though. There's 13 zones in the US and Canada, and the zones were last updated in 2012. Zone 1 is the coolest, and that's the minimum winter temperature is -60 to -50 degrees. And so we do have that here in Alaska, just not in the Anchorage area. And zone 13 is the warmest, and their average winter temps are 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. A microclimate is an area within a region, and that growing climate is different than the general zone of that region. For example, I live in a zone 4B, but in part of my yard, I have a very sunny, very sheltered corner next to my house. I'm able to grow flowers there that generally enjoy living in zones that are far above 4B. All right, so I have a note that somebody in the 99507 is more of a 2 to 3 zones, and that could be because of your microclimate in your yard. And the USDA zones are a general guideline, and so I haven't researched every single zip code, but these are the ones that come up when you type them into the USDA website. So like I was saying, I have a 4B, but then I have pockets in my yard that are very warm and dry. And then I also have a different corner that's 30 feet away. I have a different corner that's 30 feet away, but it's shaded by fencing on both sides and a building and a tree. And so it's always cooler and damper than anywhere else in my garden. Is everybody able to hear me now? Turned up the volume a little bit. Thank you. Okay, So this looks far more intense than it actually is. This is about sunlight and shade. A lot of people have asked me how to figure out which direction their garden faces. So here are two different ways that you can figure it out. If you use a compass, you can use an actual compass, or most phones have a compass app. You want to face your garden. So if your garden's in your backyard, stand with your back to your house and then face your garden. And if your compass says south, you have a south-facing garden. You can also use an online map to look up your address. You want to go into the street view like I've done here with Alaska Mill and Feed. You want to look at it so you're looking at the front of your house or building. And then you look at the compass that's in the lower right corner. If it's red at the top, that means north, white means south. If the garden's in the backyard, it's the reverse of what the front of the house is. So the front of Alaska Mill and Feed is south facing, and the back, where our garden center is, faces north. Sunlight and shade are important to know because plants have minimum sunlight requirements. We get a lot of sun in the summer, but depending on your location, your plants might be too shaded to thrive. If you aren't sure where the sun is in your garden, play it safe this year by growing partial shade tolerant vegetables and then map your sun exposure over the summer. And so dappled shade is generally what you get when your garden is underneath trees or a forest canopy. You get sunlight, but it's just sort of spotty there. And then I have an example of raised garden beds that get full light, full sunlight, but then we don't know, as that sun moves throughout the day, it might get shaded by those fences that are nearby. Okay, it can be easy to take water for granted, but there are some things that you need to consider when you're planning out your garden. Do you have a water source nearby? Is it easy for you to drag a hose over to your garden? Are there any slopes in your yard or garden area that water is going to run down? That can cause erosion or it can cause flooding. Are there any puddles that collect in your yard when it rains? If there are, then you might want to increase drainage in that area or locate your garden elsewhere. Do you receive a lot of rain or just a little bit of rain? And if there's not a water source nearby, are you willing to haul water and hand water? Then there's accessibility. If your garden isn't conveniently located, then you might not visit it very often. It would be a good idea then to choose plants that need less attention and to have watering systems that are in place. So you want to make sure it's in a convenient spot if you can. You also want to make sure that you can move around your garden easily so that you can weed and take care of your plants. So if you look in the bottom left corner, the woman there, she's got wide paths so she can reach all of her plants and take care of them. You also want to make sure that everybody who's going to be using the garden will be able to reach the plants and work there comfortably. So that might mean that you need to have raised beds so they're higher up off the ground, or even tabletop gardens. And then if you're going to have to haul in soil or heavy things, you might want to make sure that you can easily navigate a wheelbarrow to your garden. People can spend a lifetime studying soil, but these are just some very quick basics. Sandy loam is generally the preferred soil type, especially for root crops because it's unobstructed and it has good drainage. Some vegetables, though, grow better in clay soil because their roots get better anchorage. Soil pH is also important because every plant has a preferable pH range. You can amend your soil by adding things like lime if you want a more alkaline soil, or sulfur if you want more acidic soil. And there are a lot of different ways for you to test your soil. Store-bought kits are really quick, but they can be overly simplified sometimes. You can send in a soil sample, but that takes more time and but it does give you a more in-depth soil profile, and often they'll give you growing and amendment suggestions as well. And this is just a picture of not even all of the soil tests that we sell here at the mill. There's a great UAF cooperative extension publication by Stephen Brown that you can take a look at if you are interested in sending your soil out to a soil testing laboratory. All right, and then we have unwanted visitors that we need to prepare for. It's good to have plans for keeping out moose, rabbits, and birds. If it's your first year gardening, you might not know what to protect your garden from. My wooden fence keeps out moose and snowshoe hares, but I found that birds sometimes eat my berries. I really like how this gardener has used bamboo poles with the clay pots on top to drape netting over so he can protect his vegetables from birds. And we have a lot of different things at Alaska Mill and Feed that can help you keep out unwanted pests. We've got repellent spray like plant skid, which will keep moose out. We do have the bird netting. We have owl decoys, electric fencing. These are just some basic solutions for problems that you might encounter when you're planning out your garden. If you have really good sun, but it's only on your porch or deck, then you can consider a container garden. If you have poor soil quality, then you can amend it, or you can use raised beds where you bring in new soil, or you can try a container garden. If your garden plot doesn't drain, then you can add organic material to the soil. You can divert water runoff. You can use raised beds or a container garden. If you need it to be wheelchair accessible, the raised beds or a tabletop garden that have even paths around them work really well. If your hose is really hard to move around, if you need to get it around corners and things like that, then you can install drip irrigation that stays in place so you're not having to haul that hose around every day. And if your zone's too cold for desired plants, then you can try greenhouse gardening or indoor gardening. Okay, now that we have a better understanding of our garden location, we can see what we can plant. So what is it that you're really interested in growing? What plants do you like to eat? What grow well in your zone? What's your sun situation like? What's your microclimate? And what's something new that you want to try? It's always fun to experiment. This is a picture of a garden basket that I picked from my garden last year. There's calendula, it's the orange flower in there. I grow that every year, but there's also lemon verbena, which doesn't tend to grow well in my zone, but I've got that really sheltered hot spot, so it gets about 4 to 5 feet tall. Cherry tomatoes are always fun to grow. Feverfew is a pretty easy one, and it's a self-seeder. And zucchini, potatoes, those always grow well up here. But the lemon verbena was my big experiment last year. Thank you very much for saying my basket's beautiful. Let's see, I always grow what my family likes to eat, and that I know, and what I know grows well. But if you aren't going to eat it, if you're not interested in how it looks, then maybe don't grow it. If you know nobody in your family is going to eat zucchini, then you don't need to grow zucchini just because everybody else is. So your garden is very personal, and you can pick and grow what you want. Okay, this is by no means an exhaustive list of what you can grow in Alaska, but these vegetables usually do really well, and they're fairly easy to grow. And you can find lists like this in a couple of different locations. A really good one to look at is the UAF Cooperative Extension Publication Recommended Variety List for South Central Alaska. They also have one for Interior Alaska, and I think that they might have one for Southeast as well. I'm just not sure. And that's my dog Bowmore, and cabbage is his favorite food in the entire world. So I always grow red cabbage specifically for my dog. And then to the right, that's not my photo, but it's a picture of kohlrabi. And I grow that mostly because it looks really cool. It grows above the ground like that, and they look like little alien spaceships. They're also very tasty. And these are some vegetables that tolerate partial shade, and I really want to emphasize the partial shade part. There aren't vegetables that are going to thrive in full shade. It's possible to grow them in partial shade, but many will not thrive, and most of them won't reach the same size as if you grew them in full sun, and you won't get as much fruit or yield from them. You want to make sure that your soil quality is really good if you're trying to grow in partial shade, and you want to keep an eye on the watering requirements. If they're in the shade, they might not need as much water, and it could be easy to overwater them. All right, so I really encourage new gardeners to start small. It's easy to get carried away and overwhelmed. I personally still buy way too many different types of seeds, and I have to edit my choices every year. There's some veggies that are very easy to grow that will give you feelings of success while you get your gardening skills underneath you and while you learn. I think carrots are a great one, especially if you have kids. Carrots are really fun to grow. Chives, kale, snap peas, potatoes, cherry tomatoes, and strawberries. And some of those are also tolerant to partial shade, so they can be really good to grow. If you have a small garden, it's easier to weed and maintain. And if you're just getting started with gardening, you won't be investing as much money, time, and labor while you learn if you really like gardening and while you learn what works best for you. After you pick out your vegetables, I would consider adding some flowers. They attract pollinators, they can protect against pests, and they can improve the taste and yield of your vegetables. So on the left-hand side, there are some marigolds there at the bottom. Marigolds attract beneficial insects. They also kill bad nematodes in the soil, but it's only where the marigold roots touch. And so they make a really great cover crop. And then after the marigolds are gone, you can plant vegetables where they were, and there will be less of the bad nematodes in the soil. Borage is the blue flower in the middle. It's one of my favorite ones to grow because bees really love it. And so it attracts a lot of pollinators. And so if you have vegetables that need to be pollinated, so if we eat their fruit, like squash or strawberries, then you want to have lots of pollinators drawn to your area. Borage also attracts aphids, so it can act as a trap plant, and it releases calcium and potassium in the soil. Yes, that is borage, the middle one. It releases calcium and potassium in the soil, but it does easily self-seed. So you want to keep an eye on it. Don't let it go to seed if you don't want it to spread in your garden, or make sure you pull it out. And the nasturtiums are definitely a favorite for most people to grow in the garden. They attract pollinators and beneficial insects as well, and they also act as a trap crop. So insects will be drawn to them, like aphids will be really drawn to the nasturtiums, and then the aphids won't go to your other plants that you want to harvest. Okay, so now we are going to put everything all together. So my very first rough draft, I start writing down the vegetables and flowers that I'm interested in growing. And then I look at whether I want to do a garden bed or if I want to plant in rows in the ground, if I'm going to use containers or not. And while I'm choosing vegetables, I'm thinking about if I'm going to need to start them from seed, if I'm going to purchase starts, or if I'm going to do a combination. So right here, my garden plan is 2 4x4 raised beds. And the vegetables I'm going to look at growing are snap peas, carrots, kale, chives, and strawberries. And the flowers I'm going to use are the borage and marigolds. And I've noted that the snap peas, I'm going to need a trellis for them. So that'll be another piece of equipment that I have to buy or make. And this is a good plan for full sun. And some of them you can direct seed, like the snap peas and the carrots. They don't transplant very well, so you're going to want to plant them directly in the soil where you're going to grow them. Kale and chives you can also direct seed, but I like to get mine started a little bit earlier. Some vegetables and flowers don't like growing near each other because they compete or they change the soil chemistry or for other reasons. So you want to take a look and see if your chosen vegetables grow well together. It doesn't mean that you can't grow them. It just, you might not want to grow them next to each other. And I have a question: when will Alaska Mill and Feed have seeds and small veggie plants this year? Do we order online like last year and pick up, or in person, or both? Right now we have seeds. So you are welcome to come in and get your seeds or call our customer service team. Small veggie plants, we should be getting our starts in April. And right now we're thinking that people will be able to go into the greenhouses, but you should also be able to order online. And that's all contingent on nothing changing. So as of right now, that is the plan, but things can always change. Companion planting can increase growth, improve flavor, and deter pests. So snap peas really like carrots, but they don't like growing next to chives. Kale and strawberries do not like growing near each other. It's mostly the strawberries that affect the kale. Let's see. And then the borage and the marigolds get along with everybody, so I could plant them wherever I want to, but I'm not going to plant the strawberries and the kale together. There's a lot of charts like this online that you can find. It's pretty easy to type in companion plant carrots, and then you can find out all the things that carrots grow well with. And if you haven't made enough decisions yet, now you have to decide how you're going to plant them. So there's planting in rows, like the picture in the left-hand corner. It's a very tried and true method. We've been doing it for centuries. It's easy to reach every plant, and you can grow more plants generally, but you do take up more room. Square foot gardening is great for small areas. You usually do it in a raised bed. There's no wasted space because you plant everything close together. There's less weeding because everything's planted close together so that the weeds can't grow up in between the plants. But it can be pretty cramped for larger crops. Plants like pumpkins, they require a lot of space, so you might not be able to grow very many of them. And then the raised beds can be more expensive, plus you have to put the soil in them. And then this is just a basic chart for the plants that I'm going to grow in my garden. I do use the square foot garden method. I find that it works really well for me because I used raised beds. And some of the, like for strawberries, if you look up the square foot planting recommendations, they say to put 4 strawberries in a square foot. I find that that doesn't work for me. So it's a trial and error thing. I like to give my strawberries about 18 inches. And does this work on pots too? You can, yeah. I would take a look at what vegetables you're interested in growing in pots, and then look and see how many people tend to plant in a certain pot. You want to make sure that your pots are deep enough if you're going to be growing things like carrots. And so if you have a 1 square foot pot and your pot is at least 7 inches deep, then you should be able to grow 16 carrots there, but you're going to want to make sure that you water more often because pots can dry out faster, and you might need to add some more nutrients into your pot too. All right, so this is my final garden plan that I drew out. It's a really rough sketch, but it does represent a lot of careful thought and planning. So the garden zone, which is a 4B, and my sunlight have been considered. So I'm in full sun right there. I've picked raised beds over in-ground planting. My ground can be a little bit boggy in my yard, and so I like to raise up my beds and add soil into them instead of planting in the ground and having to deal with the poor drainage. And I chose square foot planting instead of rows, but I did change some of the planting recommendations because I know that I don't like to grow as many strawberries in a square foot as is generally recommended. I've indicated in the left bed that I need a trellis for the peas. And then I map out about how many plants I'm going to plant in each square foot. It means that I can save on seeds because I know exactly how many I'm going to need. And then I just really like having a visual plan as well. On the right-hand side, you can see with the strawberries, I don't have all the strawberry plants right next to each other. And I did this on purpose. I have the borage plants in the middle so they attract all the pollinators. And then I have the chives in between the strawberry plants. And this is to space out my strawberries, but it's also so that if I have some sort of pest that starts attacking one strawberry plant, it's harder for the pest to then migrate over to my other strawberries. And it works for diseases as well. And my question is, does your trellis provide the right amount of shade for your peas? And so the trellis can provide shade for the peas. If I'm really concerned about shade for peas, I would probably put something in front of it like the kale to shade them a little bit more. I plant my peas pretty early in the spring, and so they're done fairly early before I get a lot of sun in that part of my yard, before I get too much so that the peas get burnt and unhappy. But that's a really good question because peas do like to have a little bit of partial shade as it gets hotter in the summer. Does anybody have any more questions? I'm happy to answer any. This is just a pretty basic rundown of how I plan out a vegetable garden, but I'm happy to answer any questions. How early do you plant carrots or potatoes in bags? I will be teaching a potato planting class in the next month, I think. But generally you want to wait until after the last frost for potatoes. And then carrots, I plant those a couple weeks before the last frost, but they do take a long time to germinate. So you kind of have to plan out when you want your carrots to start growing. Then I have a question. What do you use to fertilize your bed at the start of the season, or do you? Ooh, just one second. Questions are rolling in. What do you use to fertilize your bed at the start of the season, or do you fertilize mid-season except for potatoes? Do you till before planting or not? Okay, so I usually add compost to my beds in the fall, and I till it in just the first couple of inches, but I don't till everything. I don't want to break up the soil structure. I really like how my soil is right now, so I'm just trying to add in more nutrients to it. I will put in an organic fertilizer sometimes, especially if I've had really heavy feeders in a certain bed, like if I've had zucchini or any kind of squash plant, they take up a lot of nutrients, so I'll add more back in. I also use green manures and I rotate my beds. And so last year I had one bed that just had the Alaska melon feed cover crop. I think it has the Austrian peas in it, and that fixes nitrogen back into my soil. And then after I let that grow up several inches, I till it under, and then it acts as a green compost. And so it can decompose over the winter and add all those nutrients back into my soil. Do I fertilize mid-season? I tend to, yes. I will use It depends on what it is that I'm growing, and if I feel like it needs more nutrients. I don't like to over fertilize because I don't want to just get a bunch of really lush new growth in my leaves if that's not what I'm going after. That if you have like a lot of nitrogen, then you get a lot of leaf growth, and that new leaf growth can attract pests like aphids. And so to keep my aphids down, I sort of deal with having maybe slightly smaller vegetables, but ones that are a little bit healthier. I think those are all the questions for that one answered. Do you rotate your plants each year, or do you replace enough of your soil annually to not need to? I have a row style garden and I'm wondering if I need to rotate this year. I do really encourage rotation. It helps prevent diseases spreading from crops. And then also you can replace nutrients in your soil if you grow things like beans or peas, because they can fix the nitrogen back in there. It's just generally a good practice to do crop rotation, and there are a lot of resources that you can look up on which crops to grow after which other ones. Do you cover your beds in the winter? I cover my garlic bed because I plant my garlic in the fall, and then I put about 8 to 10 inches of straw on top of it. And then I do let all of my beds get covered up with snow. I find snow is a really good mulch. I will, just one second, the questions move the other questions. So there we go. Do you cover your beds in the winter? I find that snow is a really great mulch. I will also use leaf mold to cover my beds, especially the ones that I haven't had a cover crop in. Leaf mold is where you gather a whole bunch of leaves and you kind of, you cut them up so they're in smaller size, and then you let them decompose a little bit, and then they make a really great mulch for your beds. How do I keep slugs out? So personally, what I do is all of my raised beds, I have copper netting around the top of it and at the bottom if I can have enough netting. So that way the slugs don't like the copper. It gives them a little bit of a shock when they touch it, so they stay away from it. I also use just hand picking. So I'll set slug traps, which is just a piece of board. I'll put it down in my garden, and then I will go out in the evening or at night, and after they've gathered underneath the boards, and I'll pick them and then get rid of them that way. How do you tell if you are overwatering? That is an excellent question, and it can be very hard to tell. You want to look at your plants. If you think you're doing everything right, but your plant is suffering, or if it looks kind of moldy or small, sometimes the leaves will even start to look a little bit watery, then you are overwatering. But it is a very tricky question to answer. There are a lot of different ways that your plants can react depending on what kind of plant it is. And yeah, it looks like Linda successfully used copper tape stapled around the edge of their raised beds and never had a problem. And that's probably for the slugs then. Any more questions? These are excellent. Yeah, so somebody else says that their grandfather would put a cup out with an inch of beer to trap the slugs, and that also works. I have done that as well. I just also have a dog who will come and drink the beer, so I don't put it out. Okay, the question is, do you pull the flower off either the male or female squash to encourage them to grow? Someone told me about that practice last year, but couldn't find any evidence for it. I personally don't. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work. I just haven't tried that before. So if you have a couple of different squash plants that you're growing this year, then it would probably be worth it to take one of them and try doing that. Do you have any suggestions about how to do drip irrigation on raised beds? So there are there's different styles of drip irrigation out there, and I know that we sell some here in the spring. And I would look up, I would just look up the different styles that there are just so that you can see what might work best for you. There are some that are a grid, so they're stiff and made out of like PVC pipes. And there are also some that are more of soaker hoses that you can move around your plants. And those might work better for you if you don't have everything in straight rows. Anything else? All right. Well, if you do think of any questions, I'm going to be here all weekend, and so you can give the store a call, and they can connect you with me. And then you can also email me. My email is taras@alaskamill-and-feed.com, and Alaska Mill and Feed is all spelled out. If you can't remember that,
We'll type it in the chat real quick.
they're typing it into the chat because I didn't think about that. And somebody asked if I have a type of seed that I prefer, and I don't. I have seeds from all the different companies that we sell here. Plus I get some from other seed companies because I like to experiment with new plants. So I try a whole bunch of different ones. I do really like the Denali seeds, but I also have a bunch from Renee's Garden and Lake Valley and Ed Hume. So I have lots of different seeds. Do you have a suggestion for total shade plants? Not especially. Ferns like shade. And somebody asked, will you be sending out the PowerPoint? Yes, we will be. It will probably get sent out on Monday, but I would just keep a lookout for it. But for total shade plants, I haven't done a lot of research on it. I did try to look for some for this class, and there aren't very many out there that are going to do very well. And it depends on how total your shade is. If you can get maybe 1 to 2 hours of sun a day, then there are some plants out there that'll work. Like kale is pretty shade tolerant, and then there are herbs that will do fairly well. Do you have a soil mix recommendation for inside starts? For inside starts, I just use the seed starting mix from Black Gold. I like it because it's organic, so I don't have to worry about that. And all of my starts have always done really well with it. How do you keep spinach from bolting? I look for spinach types that are specifically made to be bolt resistant. And then I also try to grow my spinach in partial shade. And if I can't grow it in partial shade because of my rotation that year, then I will use shade cloth to give it some shade during the summer. Are any of the plants mentioned averse to growing in pots? We do a lot of gardening on our deck. Let's see. I don't think any of the ones that I have in my final garden plan are averse to growing in pots. For the peas, what I might do is use something like a little bit longer, like maybe one of the earth boxes. And that way I can put a trellis behind it and make sure that the peas get a really good foothold with their roots in there as well. But everything else does really well in pots. Strawberries does great in pots. You can grow carrots in pots. If you don't have deep pots, I usually like mine to be at least 7 to 8 inches tall in order to grow carrots. You can get varieties that are shorter. So we sell some here where we have seeds where they're short carrot varieties. The little French Parisian market carrots are great. They're round and they're only about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long. And those can be really great for growing in pots too. All right, so I think we're going to wrap it up now. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any more questions, like I said, feel free to give a call or track me down in the store or send me an email. If you could just give me a couple of days to respond to emails because I don't have a desk-based job, so I have to use the computer when I get the chance. But I will respond to you. So thank you so much.